Welcome back to English with Kim. I'm Kim, and I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. I'm so excited to welcome you back to my interview series, and today we're going to be talking with someone very special. Today we're talking with Danielle of Get Test Obsessed, and the reason this interview is even more special than normal is that 3 years ago, Danielle and I actually used to work together back in Boston. We worked together at the same language institute. This is kind of your opportunity to see two people catching up after a long time. Kind of imagine us in a networking situation where we're asking each other, what have you been working on? And this is also your opportunity to learn about our teaching philosophies, learn about why we like working with highly motivated learners because we are highly motivated teachers, and learn about why mindset is so important. And this is interesting because we're going to talk about how moving from the classroom to online enables us to really target the type of people we can truly help with our resources, our insights, in our programs. So I'm so excited to welcome Danielle to the YouTube channel, and I would love to give Danielle a chance to tell you about herself and tell me a little bit about what she's working on. Hi, Danielle.
Hi, Kim. It's so nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's so great to finally get a chance to catch up with you and hear what you've been doing. So, Danielle, I would love it if you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and how you are focusing on helping non-native English speakers get obsessed with learning the TOEFL and mastering the TOEFL and really mastering life skills and communication skills.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm so happy to share this with you. Because we did have the opportunity to work together in person when we were working at the same language institute. I specialized in the TOEFL test prep, and now I am taking that online. The reason behind the name for my particular website, Get Test Obsessed, as you and advanced English learners know, to be obsessed with something is just another way to say to be crazy about something, to really love it and enjoy it. And while I know that it is probably a long stretch for people to think about being in love with a test, I would like them to really fall back in love with language learning in order to prepare for the test. I feel like way too many students make the mistake of thinking that test prep is when I sit down with my test prep book and that's it, and they don't think about it otherwise. And I'm really here to make sure that they see how they can make standardized test prep part of their lifestyle, because it's not only for the day of the test and then done. I like to teach online because, as you mentioned, we are both really motivated individuals, and I think there are a lot of really motivated students out there that we can find beyond just the people that are local. Like you said, we worked together up in Boston, and now I'm back in New Jersey, so without the internet, we wouldn't have reconnected either. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and what I'm up to. I know you've done a lot of traveling since I've left Boston. You want to fill me in on that?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, and Danielle hasn't heard the whole story, when we worked together in Boston, right after she left and moved to New Jersey, and then I left and I moved to Chile, and that's when I worked in Chile. I worked in some schools in Chile, had the experience to work with English teachers in Chile, and I also helped train volunteer English teachers to help them become more competent and more comfortable in the classroom. I've really had a wide range of experiences since we last saw each other, but like you, I'm focusing on teaching online because I really want to help kind of demystify the important things about communication. And that's kind of an interesting thing to bring us into our main topic today, is that something I learned working with non-native speakers living in Chile is that a lot of times people didn't really understand the cultural codes or the ways that native speakers communicate. And because it's something that you really get a sense of when you're living inside the culture, you're living in a native English speaking country. And this is something that TOEFL test prep really does focus on. They want you to be able to participate in university settings, whether you're a university student or a grad student or even a professor. I know a lot of professionals that take the TOEFL in order to prove their English. And that's something I focus on with my focus on communication strategies and accent reduction. It's how can you communicate more clearly? So I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you demystify the TOEFL and help people understand what it is that the TOEFL is really asking them to learn. Because I think so many people are focused on test scores, or they're focused on, oh, I just need this one time and then I'm done. So I would love to hear your approach, because I think your approach is refreshing.
Why, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think you could not be more spot on with your kind of insight as to why some people really, really struggle. They see the same exact practice test scores month after month, and then they just get so frustrated that they want to give up. One of the things that I really encourage students to do is look at the philosophy behind the test. ETS states that they really are looking to to make sure that you're prepared for those university level interactions, whether that's getting advice or giving advice like you would see in the integrated speaking questions on the TOEFL, whether that's listening to a lecture, hearing a student ask a question during the lecture, and then understanding how the professor has responded. All of those types of things. I think very frequently students will assume that it is academic only, and obviously a lot of the TOEFL is very academic when you're thinking of like reading passages or formal lectures, but there's a whole lot that makes a better connection to those regular everyday interactions that happen all the time on college campuses. Do you know anything about speaking questions 1 and 2, the independent speaking questions?
Okay, you're making me go really back in time here, because before I started working with you, I worked at another language institute in Boston, and I taught the TOEFL very briefly. But the thing I remembered that we focused on was being able to formulate your thoughts and deliver your thoughts in a very clear way. And something I really emphasize here on my YouTube channel is how to communicate more clearly and effectively, more like a native speaker. And one of the things that I know is really important to me is helping people understand the very direct American style of communication. So I imagine that this kind of structure of tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, I think that plays into the TOEFL speaking. Am I right?
It definitely does, especially when it comes to the independent speaking questions. There are 2 main objections that students have. The first is that for the independent speaking questions, they get almost no prep time. You only get 15 seconds to prepare for those questions, and some students say, that's not reasonable. How can I come up with something to say in only 15 seconds? Well, if you're having a conversation with someone in English, kind of like we are, you can't sit there and actually take notes. And that's what the TOEFL is trying to kind of force you to do. The other thing that people have an objection to is, how can I fill up that time? That 45 seconds seems really, really long when that timer is slowly ticking by. So by making sure that you have that same kind of like introduction, telling them what you're going to tell them, telling them, and then wrapping it up with tell them again, you can reach that 45 seconds and always have a structure to rely on instead of trying to reinvent the wheel every time. Yeah, without a doubt.
Oh, and that's just so important. I feel like I always want to like hit people over the head and just really emphasize that Americans are expecting this type of cultural communication. We're expecting you to introduce your idea, get to the point, and then remind us what we learned. And something I've talked about in previous videos is that a lot of times in other cultures, it's kind of the reverse. It's that the speaker can just philosophize and share their ideas, and the listener needs to understand the meaning. But in America, or in the United States, people really do expect you to explain to them what it is you want them to know, which can be kind of like annoying if you're used to a more philosophical, kind of a more intelligent, more considerate way of expressing yourselves. But in the US, we are expecting this way of delivering the message. We want to make sure the message is really clear. And I think that's so important for people to understand, like about actually achieving their goals on the TOEFL or when leading a business meeting or anything. It's kind of all connected. So I'd love to hear what else you have to say about that.
It's not even just for speaking when you're talking about kind of the setup, then tell them, and then remind them of why that's important. The same kind of philosophy goes for TOEFL writing as well, or really any kind of writing in the American university situations. For example, in American writing, you're expected to have a thesis statement. The thesis statement is expected to be the last sentence of the introduction. A lot of students will kind of hide their thesis statement. They'll go out of their way to craft this beautiful sentence that describes exactly what the main idea of their essay is, and then they don't put it as the last sentence of their intro. And if you have plenty of time to look for it, of course you can find it. But if you're thinking about something like the TOEFL, where the graders only have a limited amount of time to go through these essays and give a score, you want to make sure that you're playing to those expectations. Just like you said with a business meeting, you want to make sure that you're giving people what they expect so that way they can follow along more easily. So I think there are plenty of ways that that is kind of at play in everyday American interactions.
And you made me think of something interesting about the TOEFL, because the TOEFL, a lot of the speaking exercises exercises and the writing exercises, it's kind of abbreviated. It's making you get to the point really quickly. And that's something that I think about a lot, even if you watch a YouTube video like this. Usually the most important points I make in my YouTube videos are in the first 10 to 15 minutes. And then maybe I'll expound and I'll share more information. I'll continue to go in greater depth, or I'll answer questions if it's a live video. It's most important that I share my main points right at the beginning, because that's the way that you know that you're going to get the information you need from this particular video, for example. So I think it's interesting because obviously, like, people tend to think with test prep that it's outside of their real life experience, like you're kind of faking it. But this kind of ability to abbreviate your ideas is really important, don't you think?
Absolutely. And if you are one of those people who maybe the listening section is where you struggle, note taking, not something that comes naturally to you, maybe you're not the kind of person who is a strong audio learner, you're more of like a visual learner, so that's why it might be more challenging. Even the lectures, very frequently the professor will start off with, today we're going to discuss topic, gives a definition of the topic, says exactly what to expect, and then goes through the 3 main points that the lecture is going to cover. So it is absolutely applicable because that is what you can expect when you sit in the university lecture hall.
And not only the university lecture hall, but also in business meetings. A lot of times you're handed a piece of paper with an agenda because people want to make sure they get through these talking points. That's why you get kind of an outline of what you can expect during a conference. But I know, especially teaching in the traditional classroom, you also have an agenda. Whenever I prepare for any sort of online session, I also have an agenda. So it's kind of something that is part of the culture. So preparing your ideas and kind of understanding how other people have prepared your ideas, it helps you dissect this aspect of American culture.
Absolutely. And I love that we're finding so many ways to make connections because, like I said before, I think that so many students do themselves a disservice when they think they're only preparing for the TOEFL when they've got their test book out. No, all of these interactions can be preparing you for the TOEFL.
And that's actually why I wanted to talk to you, because I think that the TOEFL is a really important topic for a lot of learners. A lot of times people leave comments. If it's not the TOEFL, it might be the IELTS or another exam where they're kind of like, I need this speaking score. And I always try to remind them that the skills I give them about changing the subject or clarifying their ideas, these are all really useful skills in order to have interactions both in the test if they're having a job interview or an academic interview. They need to be able to use these skills, but it also helps them with the goals that they're hoping to achieve in the future. Like when they go to university or start grad school or a graduate program or get an exchange, a professorship, whatever it is, they need to be able to speak in this way. Actually, that's some random thing that you may not know about me is that back in 2014, I was working with a lot of Turkish doctors who were applying to be interns at hospitals in the United States, and they needed to learn how they could easily and comfortably present their cases. And so they actually practiced with me. We practiced watching the TV show Modern Family, and they would present what happened in the TV show. So kind of test prep is related to that because you're learning how to listen to something and then present the ideas back to people. And I feel like that's a skill a lot of non-native speakers are not necessarily focusing on. A lot of times the way that you listen to someone and the way you listen and are able to repeat ideas is really key in professional situations too.
Absolutely. I think you said 2 great things there. The first one, summarizing is such a critical skill on the TOEFL. If I had to pick probably the 2 main skills that are tested on all 4 sections of the TOEFL, it would be summarizing and paraphrasing. Almost all of the questions relate to that in some capacity. The other thing that you mentioned that I think is really important is on the TOEFL, you will encounter those, they call them function questions. In the listening, you'll get a little piece of the audio repeated and they'll say, why did the student say this? Or something like that. And the reason they're looking to make sure that you understand that, if you were actually in that situation, if you don't know that phrase, you have no idea if the professor just agreed to give you an extension, or you don't know if you are given permission to ask them at this time for a letter of recommendation or whatever the situation may be. So making sure that you are both able to present yourself well and be able to interact with people, whether that's to make a formal presentation or just to have normal, what seems to be casual and comfortable interactions with people, so important for both test day and afterwards.
Yeah, I want to re-emphasize something that you mentioned, which is that summarizing and paraphrasing are such essential skills. And I actually teach these as part of professional communication because we have this thing we call active listening, and I'll have other videos and resources on it, which will be linked below the video. But active listening is when you show someone that you're listening to them and that you heard them. And in American culture, people are expecting you to show them that you're listening in some way that's not just by you nodding your head and smiling, which is traditional in a lot of other cultures. They want you to repeat back certain things they said, have an emotional reaction, a physical reaction on their face. Obviously, in the TOEFL exam, you're not necessarily showing this expression, but that's why you also have to be able to paraphrase your ideas. Think about if you're on a conference call, you want to show somebody not just yes, yes, okay, yes. You want to be able to show them, okay, this is what I heard. This is what we're going to do. This is what we agreed on. So these skills of summarizing and paraphrasing go beyond the test. And I think the reason that it's so important for people to think about what are the skills that people are testing you on is because these are skills that you're going to need in order to succeed in academic and professional environments.
Absolutely. Knowing those life skills, critical. Whether your intention is to get your bachelor's or your master's degree, or your intention is to go right into the workforce, you need to be able to show that you know those methods of communication. And I think just the smile and nod is particularly kind of like a trap for some of our non-native speakers, because if they are just smiling and nodding, my experience working with students, sometimes they understand and sometimes they're just smiling and nodding at me. And as a language teacher with experience, I know that frequently that means that I need to ask them to repeat back to me or ask them a follow-up question. If I didn't have that background, I might not be as aware of that situation, and that person could walk away not having understood anything I said. And because in the workforce they might encounter people who are not as familiar with working with non-native speakers, I think that's particularly dangerous to get into. So making sure they have those skills is so important.
I was just going to say the same thing, that what happens if you're a non-native speaker who's mostly interacted with native English speakers who are kind of teaching you or guiding you in some way, we're used to listening for the meaning behind your words or for asking clarifying questions. But not every native speaker is super conversationally gifted, or they really understand what it's like to learn a language. One thing we mention a lot in these interviews is that most Americans don't learn another language, or they don't learn it to proficiency. So they don't understand the challenges you're having. So you may not be working with other people who are, interacting with other people, depending on the school you go to, that understand that you may not understand and that they have to actually ask you to clarify. These are skills people learn both as native speakers, as they start working professionally, as they go to college and they start studying, they learn how to ask these questions. So the TOEFL, I think, is kind of trying to make sure that people actually have the skills, like we keep saying, they need to succeed.
Yeah, definitely. Without a doubt.
So I want to transition to talking about, now that we've established that it's so important to focus on the communication skills behind this kind of test prep, I want to talk about how people can achieve their goals on the TOEFL or any other sort of test that they may be taking in order to show their proficiency in English. And I really want to hear what you think is important when you start working with someone or you start guiding someone on the TOEFL.
The very first thing that I want to talk about is that whenever I take on a student, whether that student has approached me or maybe like the director of that language institute has, I always ask some key questions to make sure that I'm working with a student that I will be a good fit for. I know that I'm a very motivated individual and I look for highly motivated individuals to work with. Now, that doesn't mean that if they have under a certain number, I won't work with them. That's not true at all. Instead, what I do is I always ask, what is your starting score? And what is your goal score? If a student can't answer that for me, that's a huge red flag, because they don't know what they don't know. They don't know how much progress they need to make. They have no clear plan. While I am so interested in helping people achieve their goal score, I need to make sure that I'm working with students who are looking at it the right way. A big pet peeve of mine is when I do talk to a student directly and I ask them what score they want, they tell me they want a 120 because that's the highest you can achieve. Well, if you just tell me you want a 120, that to me signals that you haven't actually looked at any of the schools that you're interested in to find out what their threshold is. Thinking that you want to get a perfect 120 is a really, really difficult maybe even impossible goal to be setting for people. So I want to make sure that I'm working with both students who are very motivated as well as really realistic. If your program requires an 80 and your goal score is to get an 85 or a 90, great. That makes perfect sense. That doesn't mean you can't exceed that. That's obviously what we want, but thinking if it's not it's 120 or bust. It's 120 or it doesn't matter if I take the test. That's also another red flag for me about making sure that I'm working with students that have the right information and the right motivation.
I really want to unpack what you just said because there's a couple of things that we're including within there that I think are so important for people watching this video. So one is that when people say they want a perfect score, they're kind of aiming towards perfection, which can be a big mindset block. And I know we want to talk a little bit about mindset. Number two, I think sometimes a perfect score, especially it also happens in American culture. I felt this way when I was a high school student. I always wanted to get the best score ever, but it's kind of like the score is trying to prove something about yourself rather than the score kind of being a tool that will help you get towards the goal that you want. And so I want to talk about how you're not trying to prove that you're an intellectual, intelligent person. You're trying to prove you can communicate like an intellectual, intelligent person. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And one of the things that holds so many people back, especially on the speaking section, is that they don't use the kind of like normal pacing that you would assume someone would use when they're speaking in English, because they are thinking so hard about the next word, to not make a grammar mistake, to not make a vocabulary mistake, that they end up sounding completely and totally unnatural. If you speak and you know that as long as you're communicating effectively, if you do make a little mistake, you say, I mean, and you continue. That's what's expected in English. Even native speakers make mistakes. So I think, especially when non-native speakers expect perfection, they're setting themselves up for failure. It's going to mean that they're going to get discouraged more easily. That's not going to lead to anything good for anyone. Obviously, the goal shouldn't just be a particular score, but really keep your eye on the prize. What is the program that you're looking to get into? Why do you want to get into that program? What are the skills you're going to need day in and day out to be successful in that program? And by looking at that instead of just, I need a 120, I think people will be way more successful in terms of their mindset.
And not only does that help with mindset, but it also helps with memory and retention and actually making these skills part of the way you communicate rather than skills that you immediately forget. I mean, if we go back in time, when I was in high school, I took what we would call the AP Advanced Placement U.S. History exam.
Yeah, me too.
I don't really remember, don't tell anyone, but I don't really remember a lot about U.S. history anymore now that it's been 20 years. So I don't really remember what I learned back then because it was just stuff I was learning for the test. It wasn't stuff I was learning in order to really deeply understand my country's history. Obviously, I do have some sensitivity to my country's history, but when you learn just for a test, you're not really making this part of your deeper knowledge. And so I think what's so refreshing about your approach and why I really wanted to have this conversation is that when people view the test prep as skills that they're going to need in order to communicate, in order to achieve, it's kind of like a nice stopping place or a continuing place, kind of a transition place on their journey where they're going to start achieving what they want in English. They're going to achieve their goals that require them to use English, and it's kind of moving them forward towards more professional communication, more academic communication, and just more successful communication in English.
I love that. I really think that for my philosophy, I like to think that students are learning for good. And I don't mean just to improve themselves and their life, but one of the ways that native speakers use the term for good is for the long term. And that's really what I'm looking for, making sure that students have that foundation. And I think a lot of students see the TOEFL as that obstacle. They write it down in their planner as, I signed up for it on this day, and like it's this huge looming terrible thing that they have to do, instead of looking at it as, I've been studying English for such a long time. This is my time to kind of show off what I know. If you look at the test with a different mindset and you think about it as an opportunity to kind of like showcase your knowledge, there are very few times when you're doing something as big as learning English or learning whatever language you are studying that you get to say, here, this is the barometer. This is how I can measure my progress. Sometimes learning a language is just so kind of vague, and you're just learning and learning and learning for such a long time that if you take a look at the TOEFL as kind of a way of saying like, wow, I really have come a long way from where I've started. That can also change, I think, the conversation regarding test prep.
Okay, so this inspired me to think about another thing that I think is important for people to understand. Like, why would they need someone like you or me to guide them towards their goals? And I think something that we have an expression in English, you don't know what you don't know until you find out. And usually you need somebody to point that out to you. It's kind of this, what we call a light bulb moment when you're like, oh, like this is what I didn't know. And it's because you may not have that insider knowledge as someone inside the culture. Something I talk about a lot with accent reduction is that, and you probably know this from being an English teacher, most English teachers don't know how to teach the American accent. It's something that the teachers learn. I learned it out of interest and then I got training in it. But for my first 5 years of teaching, I didn't really know how to teach pronunciation or how to teach how people could use word stress or sentence stress or intonation more effectively. It was something I grew interested in because I was realizing that my clients were missing this and it was making them sound annoyed or frustrated, or I realized that, people weren't easy to understand when they were speaking. Something I really want to emphasize to people is that if you need to achieve this certain goal, it can be helpful to find a guide like you or me, depending on what your goal is. It can be helpful to join a course or a program because it's, like we said at the beginning, kind of demystifying the code. And I know you have some thoughts about how this is part of the mindset that non-native speakers and learners can change their mindset in order to move forward and really make progress.
Sometimes I think that students wrongly assume that they don't need help because they're so smart. And they are so smart. And that is not what is at the center of this at all. Like you were saying, sometimes just based on our background, we're able to provide a little bit more insight because I've been teaching the test for many years now. So obviously I'll know more about the tricks and what ETS is looking for than someone who's taken one practice test. Same kind of thing when you're talking about the stress, the intonation. So I think making sure that students don't see it as I'm so smart, I don't need this kind of assistance. It's not a power dynamic kind of play. It's more like, let me share this insight with you. I find that I work with a lot of really motivated students who want to sit and memorize long lists of vocabulary because it's tangible. They can sit there, they know exactly how many words they're memorizing. They can sit down at the end and say, look, I passed the test, I have all of these answers, and then they go and they try to apply it to their writing. Using academic vocabulary is a great strategy. Throwing all of the words you've ever learned into one sentence often creates a disaster. And I think that when you do work with someone one-on-one, you're able to provide that kind of background information where I can tell you, yes, this word does mean that, but in this context, that doesn't make any sense. Or you can't use it with that preposition. It doesn't make sense to use it when you're talking about people. That's only something we use for animals, something of that nature. So I think that when really good, really motivated students do work with someone one-on-one, I think one of the biggest things to remember is that just because they're your teacher doesn't make them smarter and it doesn't make you less smart than they are. It's just they have a particular background that they know and particular insights that they want to share with you. Let them. I feel like so many people will make the same mistakes time after time because they become a little bit stubborn. They don't want to make those adjustments because they see it as like a failing on their part in some way, and that's not it at all.
Absolutely. And you made me think that there's a reason that I personally am moving away from the word teach and moving towards the words guide and coach, because I'm really guiding people towards this understanding, but they have to embrace it themselves. And I like the coaching because a lot of me helping highly motivated, intelligent, high-achieving non-native speakers is actually that they have the intellectual skills to be able to achieve their goals, but they just need a little coaching to get over their perfectionism, to be okay with having a less than perfect native speaker accent, or to understand that it's okay that they didn't know this information already, that they're able to learn this information and then move forward more confidently. So I realized that even though kind of traditional teaching dynamic is really about, I have the knowledge, I am giving you the knowledge, you sit and you listen. But a guide or a coach, like we try to do, is really trying to push people in the right direction, to kind of challenge them to push beyond their own internal limitations or their own knowledge and really help them really shine a light on the information that they most need to know. And something I talk about a lot in accent reduction, even though it's not actually related to test prep, is that more people focus attention on things that aren't important, like the pronunciation of sounds, when the music of English and the rhythm of English is what's helping people understand understand you. So if you don't know that this is what's most important for being understood, you don't know what a native speaker's ear is listening for. Or you may intellectually know and not be able to put it into practice, which I think is a big problem. And actually, that reminds me that I really wanted to talk about this. I've been talking a lot about how there's this level of awareness that you may have because you've sought out all these resources. There's amazing resources on the internet, and it's a lot of information. People get stuck before they start moving to action, and then it's harder for them to achieve their goals because they're not putting this into practice. So I'd love to hear if you have any feedback on that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, information overload is a real thing. And I think especially when it comes to something like language resources, there are so many of them out there. You could go down a rabbit hole and end up never actually doing any practice because you're just collecting all of these resources. I think that becomes quite a problem. One of the things that I really liked about what you had mentioned about seeing what we do as more of being a coach or a guide, I think that helps students kind of be more in tune to accepting our guidance instead of just blindly saying, oh yeah, it's the teacher, so it must be right. And that sometimes creates kind of like a negative attitude towards the correction or the suggestion that we're making. I've actually worked with students who, because they let their perfectionism hold them back, the writing that they have to do for the TOEFL is timed. And I would have students submit to me essays that they spent hours working on. I would explain to them that though they crafted a lovely essay, this does not help them when it comes to making sure that they're ready for the TOEFL writing section. And I think sometimes it's even those types of things that are really, really important. Making sure that you have somebody who can keep you honest and accountable is another really excellent reason to work with a coach, guide, tutor, teacher, whatever it is.
Absolutely. And actually, something that I wanted to mention here is that a lot of times, if you have so much awareness of the information, you kind of feel like you know what you're doing, but like if you're not putting it into practice, you're not being kind of pushed to challenge yourself to fit within this time limit or to really communicate effectively because you're having a real life conversation. It's just information. It's not something that becomes part of you and becomes part of the way that you're speaking. So I think that we've kind of identified two mindset issues here, which is one is kind of being blocked by perfectionism, and the other is being blocked by what you think you know and that you should know enough in order to achieve your goals. So how do you kind of move people from this kind of knowledge into putting it into practice? How do you kind of keep them moving forward towards their goals? I mean, I guess you already are starting with students that are highly motivated, which makes a difference because if you want something, you're more likely to work for it. But I think it's important to talk about how we can help people break through these kind of mindset blocks and move forward towards action.
I think when it comes to the TOEFL in particular, it's actually a little bit easier than when you're just talking about language more generally, because you do have a score, so that way you can measure things. The big mistake that I see people make is they only look at the end score and they don't look at the breakdown per section and per type of question. If you actually dissect your reading score, for example, and you look at not even just the end result of how many right and how many wrong, but how many detail questions, how many inference questions, how many vocab questions, and then you take the time that you do have to dedicate to test prep and you focus on that particular area, you're going to be way more successful than if you just say, oh, I'm going to study the TOEFL today. So I think one of the big ways that you can overcome some of the mindset problems are stop looking at the end score and look more at identifying the skills that you need to go over, reinforce, and seek out resources for focusing on that topic in particular.
You just really inspired me to think about how we talk a lot in a lot of the interviews about fluency. We talk about knowing what your goal is, what's your why, following your own goals, kind of following your own desires. And I think that with test prep, it's a little more concrete. You're able to see like these are particular sections that are being tested. These are the scores I need. These are the skills I need. But this is really just important. If you can focus on one thing at a time, you're going to make more progress than if you're trying to do everything at once and kind of trying in a bunch of directions. And I notice this a lot when people are trying to improve how they speak English. They often don't exactly know what that means, whether that's their accent, their fluency, the way they're communicating, the way their message is being received, the way that they speak in conversation. So also listening comprehension. And so I think it's just a really good thing that we should underline is that being able to break down your goals into more manageable steps, it's going to save you so much time and energy. And that's where something like working with a test prep coach like you, or working with an accent coach or communication coach like me, I think it can really help people just save so much time and energy in order to achieve their goals. I feel like so many people get discouraged, and I'm always trying to say, you can do this, you can do this, but you get discouraged because you're trying to do too much at the same time. And when you narrow your focus, you're able to achieve your goals more quickly and more effectively.
Absolutely. I mean, you could buy a program that gives you access to 1,000 hours of video for TOEFL test prep, but I don't know that that's what you want to do. I think instead, by focusing really narrowly on the very specific topics, this type of reading question, maybe question 6 for speaking and the integrated writing prompt, whatever it is, now all of a sudden you can actually see a measurable difference because you are looking for those particular topics. Instead of, now that I've bought this program, I have access to all of these files, where do I start? And again, working with someone who has that background knowledge makes it way easier. Getting a system, not just access to information, could sometimes be invaluable.
Absolutely. I would love to leave the people watching this video with kind of one takeaway, one main thing you want them to understand, either about test prep or the mindset that they need for test prep, or how we make this part of our overall communication goals. Do you have something like a one tidbit of advice you'd like to share?
I think the single biggest thing that students can do in order to improve their TOEFL score is to stop thinking that the TOEFL test prep is only when they sit down for that 1 hour every day when they are taking a practice test, doing the homework for their class, something like that. I think when they start thinking about all of the articles that they read in English from the New York Times because they saw a link on Twitter to something cool, or they follow along on Instagram with people who are teaching even just one new vocab word, these are all extra exercises to improve their situation both on the TOEFL and beyond. Same goes when you're just interacting with your friends, interacting with the current teacher you're working with. All of those things do make a difference when it comes to the TOEFL. It's not just when you see multiple choice questions. That I think is the one thing I'd love to leave people with.
I love that. And actually that kind of is similar to my approach. It's kind of like English should be part of this holistic aspect of your learning. You need to integrate it into your life. A few months ago, I interviewed Kevin from Feel Good English, and we talked about how you need to find information that inspires you, it motivates you so that you can improve your life as you're also improving your English. And I think that you can improve your test score and also improve your communication, improve your understanding of the way the language functions. I think it's a really great way to end this interview is to really think about how can you integrate this obsession with tests into actually achieving these goals in your life and feeling more confident. What everyone's trying to do is speak better English in order to feel more confident, right?
Without a doubt, I firmly believe that learning is a lifestyle, and I think that does apply to test prep as well.
Awesome. So Danielle, if people want to get in contact with you, how can they find you? What's the best way to reach you? And do you have any special resources you want to point them in the direction of?
Great. Thanks so much. So they can follow along with me at my website, which is gettestobsessed.com. That is also my handle on social media. You can get access to reading passages to make part of your lifestyle on Twitter at gettestobsessed, and I post both vocab and word puzzles on Instagram at gettestobsessed. So I'd love to see them there.
Awesome. So I would just like to remind you guys, you can find all the links that we've mentioned below the video. And if you're looking at this on my website, all of the links will be in the article that accompanies this video. So Danielle, thank you so much for joining me. It was so nice to catch up with you and kind of get nerdy about English again. And this is something I hope that those of you watching really enjoy, is that we really enjoy teaching and guiding and helping and coaching because it's part of helping people understand not only how they can speak English better, but how they can achieve their goals. It's something that I feel like those of us who have a passion for teaching get really inspired by seeing people get results. And that's why we really want to motivate you. We want to see you take action, and we want to see you move towards your goals. So thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you. It was such a blast catching up with you, and We've got to do it again soon.
Absolutely. Once again, I'm Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend, especially if you have a friend who needs some help with test prep. And I hope that you found this video helpful. As always, we would love to hear your feedback. Leave a comment below the video. We'll be happy to clarify any confusion you have, answer any questions, and we look forward to hearing if this helped you feel more motivated to achieve your goals. Thank you guys. Have a good one. Goodbye.